He called 911 from underground. What he found was never meant to be seen. This story is inspired by real investigations, documented behavioral patterns, and unresolved criminal cases. Names, locations, and identifying details have been altered. What you are about to hear is not a ghost story. It is not a legend. It is what happens when something buried stays buried for a reason. At 2:17 a.m., emergency services received a call that operators would later describe as wrong in tone. The line connected immediately. There was no screaming, no crying, no panic, only breathing, slow, controlled, measured. After 7 seconds of silence, a man spoke. "I shouldn't have come down here." The dispatcher asked him to repeat himself. The man inhaled, then said quietly, almost apologetically, "They know I'm here." The dispatcher asked for his location. Another pause. Then the man said, "I found what they hid." The call ended. 9 minutes later, police arrived at the traced address. The house was empty. The address belonged to a man named Thomas Reed. Thomas was 41 years old, a factory maintenance supervisor, divorced, no criminal record, no known enemies. He lived alone in a small town where nothing ever happened. His neighbors described him the same way: quiet, predictable, routine. Thomas woke up every weekday at 5:30 a.m. He drank black coffee, ate toast, watched the morning news without sound. He left for work at 6:15 a.m., returned home at exactly 5:42 p.m. Every day, until the day he didn't. When police entered Thomas's house, nothing looked disturbed. The front door was locked. No signs of forced entry. In the kitchen, dinner sat half-eaten on the table. A fork rested where it had been dropped. The television was still on. His wallet lay beside his keys. His phone was missing. Outside, his truck was parked perfectly straight in the driveway. It looked like a man who had planned to come back. At first, investigators treated Thomas's disappearance as voluntary. Adults leave sometimes. People restart lives. But then they checked his computer. Thomas had been searching for something. Not vacations, not jobs, not relationships, land deeds, old zoning maps, historical property surveys, specifically land that sat beneath his house. The house Thomas lived in was not new. It had been built in the 1960s on land once owned by a defunct manufacturing company. A company that shut down abruptly in the early 1980s after an environmental investigation. Records showed fines, violations, then silence. No cleanup reports, no remediation certificates, just closure. 3 days after Thomas disappeared, another man vanished. His name was Daniel Crow. Daniel lived 4 streets away. He worked as a freelance surveyor. Police initially failed to connect the cases. Until Daniel's wife turned in his phone. The last photo Daniel took was of Thomas Reed's house, specifically the backyard, specifically the ground. Police returned to Thomas's property, this time with ground-penetrating radar. What they found beneath the concrete slab of the basement changed the investigation entirely. There was a void, a rectangular hollow space, man-made, buried intentionally. Breaking through the concrete revealed a steel hatch. It had been welded shut decades earlier. The welds were old, crude, industrial. Inside the hatch was a ladder, leading down. The tunnel beneath the house was narrow, barely wide enough for one person. The air was stale, metallic. At the end of the tunnel was a small concrete chamber. Inside, investigators found Daniel Crow, alive. Barely. He had been restrained. No visible wounds. But his fingernails were torn, and carved into the wall behind him were 2 symbols. Not words. Symbols. Later identified as industrial safety markings from a company that no longer existed. Daniel survived long enough to speak. What he said reclassified the case overnight. He told investigators Thomas hadn't disappeared. Thomas had discovered something, and someone else had been watching. Decades earlier, the manufacturing company had buried chemical waste beneath multiple residential properties. Not accidentally, intentionally. When the investigation began, they sealed the tunnels. They paid officials. They waited. And then they sold the land. Families built homes on top of it, unaware, until Thomas Reed started asking questions. Thomas discovered inconsistencies in the property surveys, depth measurements that didn't align, soil reports that were altered. When he opened the basement floor, he didn't find money. He didn't find bodies. He found proof. Documents sealed in drums, photographs, names, evidence of crimes that would implicate people still alive, people with power. Thomas tried to report it, but before he could leave the tunnel, he heard someone above him, waiting. That night, Thomas made the call, and then the tunnel went silent. Authorities searched every property tied to the original company. They found more tunnels, more sealed chambers, but Thomas Reed was never found. No body, no blood, no trace. Only one thing was certain. Someone else knew what was buried, and they were still protecting it. Years later, the town was quietly evacuated. Homes were bought out, buildings demolished. The area was fenced off under the label of environmental hazard. No arrests were made, no charges filed. The official report listed Thomas Reed as a missing person, unresolved. But investigators who worked the case say something else. They say Thomas didn't disappear. They say he was erased because he found something that was never meant to surface, and because some secrets don't stay buried unless someone stays with them. If you drive past the site today, you won't see a town. You'll see an empty field. No houses, no roads, just earth, covering what remains. And somewhere beneath it, sealed in concrete and silence, is the reason Thomas Reed never came home.